It's good to be here, and it's good to be introduced that way with all my credentials up front, especially the credentials of Tisha B'Av, because for 26 years, this past Tisha B'Av, the 26th year that I presented a program that I do on the Kinnot of Tisha B'Av. Every year it's different, and the past 12 years it's been webcast all over the world. There's many thousands of people who watch it and who have comments to say. It's a Jewish audience, so of course I'll get comments to this very day. Just today I got a comment telling me how mistaken I was about something I said, or he thought I said. And also, a couple of years ago, I translated the Kinnot into English, and that's available in the Kinnot, which are published jointly by the OU Press and by Koren Publishers of Yerushalayim. It's called the Kinnot Mesoret Harav because it has Rav Soloveitchik's commentary, but my translation. Because Tisha B'Av is so much a part of my teaching life, the themes of Tisha B'Av are with me all year. People often ask me, how long does it take me to prepare? Actually, louder? Actually, I prepare all year long. I'm always preparing because it's a very large audience, and I feel the responsibility, necessity to prepare whenever I come across material that I think might be relevant for next Tisha B'Av. If Chas v'Shalom we have to commemorate it again next year, hopefully we won't. So I'm always alert to themes and topics and Divrei Torah and stories and piyutim and poems that would relate to themes of Tisha B'Av. And one of them is the theme of trauma. Of course, the greatest national trauma that we, the Jewish people, ever suffered was the Churbanot of the two Batei Mikdash, first and the second, and that was a national trauma. And everything else that we commemorate on Tisha B'Av are traumas of one sort or another, whether they're pogroms, or the expulsion from Spain, or the horrible Holocaust, which arguably is in many ways the greatest trauma of all, a trauma which is still with us, very real sense, and the traumas of our own time. There are no lack of traumas to the Jewish people. Just a few weeks ago, we suffered the loss of so many soldiers, three young boys, and other tragedies that occur. And these are all national traumas. What I would like to reflect on today is connections between trauma and teshuvah, treating trauma through teshuvah. And I'd like to do it in several different ways. And I'll plan on speaking about a half hour, 40 minutes, and then open the floor to questions and comments. Because much of what I'm going to say is for things that I've been thinking about really for the first time in recent days and weeks. You're really the first audience that I'm sharing some of these ideas with. Some of them are tentative ideas, maybe provocative ideas. But let me tell you what I have to say. First of all, I want to define trauma. It's very interesting to me. I guess I know the word trauma since I can read. But exactly what it means, I was never sure of. Now it's a word that's very widely used. It's used by clinicians, by psychiatrists, psychologists, who speak of a certain type of set of symptoms known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. People who suffer true trauma show certain kinds of symptoms. Immediately, the loss of appetite, forgetfulness, loss of personality, change of personality. And usually, this type of traumatic disorder lasts for one's entire life. And people have recurring nightmares, etc., even years In the case of Holocaust survivors, even decades, many decades. They have memories, live memories, awake memories, memories while they're asleep, and all sorts of other symptoms which persist even many, many decades after the traumatic event has occurred. But then, the average person, English-speaking person, uses the term trauma really to refer to any negative event. My grandchildren some of them are back in Baltimore, and they're great fans of the Baltimore Ravens, the football team, and the Ravens lose a game, it's a trauma. A person has a setback financially or a minor illness. This is very traumatic. The word is used very, very loosely. And in clinical terms, psychological terms, and I have training and a background in psychology too, which is why I'm so interested in this topic, not every injury or not every illness, not every loss is a trauma. Not every loss causes all the symptoms that I briefly referred to before. So what then, if we're going to be really careful about defining it, what then is a trauma that can trigger these deep emotional reactions? And how might that relate to tshuva and to the days of tshuva that are fast approaching? It's interesting. I went to graduate school a long, long time ago, long enough so that when I was pursuing my doctorate, we had to have a reading knowledge of the professional literature in our field in 2 languages, and Hebrew was not permitted. So I had to study French and German in order to receive my degree and have a reading knowledge, which I've long forgotten, both languages. But it was in that process that I learned the German word for dream. In German, a dream is a Traum. Traum is the word dream, and even in English, in the sound, you can see there's a connection between the 2 words, Traum and dream. What does the word trauma, as we relate to it in the English language, have to do with a dream? I want to read to you a quotation from a fascinating book. One of the things that I'm fascinated with, really obsessed with, is the many, many different reactions that people have to trauma. The example which haunts me the most are the reactions that different survivors of the Holocaust have. There are fewer and fewer alive these days, so I say have or had, to the Holocaust. And this has been something I've studied formally and informally for many, many years. Why is it, for example, that there are certain survivors of the Holocaust, whom many of you know, and you may be the children, grandchildren of such people, came out of the Holocaust rededicated to establishing a Jewish family, to building yeshivot, to becoming more religious in every way that they could than they were before, to a greater and deeper sense of faith in God, etc. And we know many such people, including people very close to me. However, we also know, and have experienced, and I've interviewed at great length, survivors of the Holocaust who before the Holocaust were Rabbonim, Chashuvim, Hasidic Yidden, Talmidei Yeshivos in Europe, who because of their experience in the Holocaust threw it all away. Threw it all away. There was one man, some of you I see from familiar faces from Baltimore days, there was one man, such a survivor, who studied in the Galante Yeshiva in Hungary, which was a yeshiva for specially talented Balei Kishronot Bochurim. And he had committed to memory many, many, many Mesichtos of Shas before the Holocaust when he was a boy, really a teenager. And he threw it all away with a spitefulness because of his experiences in the Holocaust, in which he said, there is no God, there can be no God, I'm throwing it all away. And he would sit in the Dunkin' Donuts in mornings in Baltimore, waiting for Yeshiva Bochurim to come in, the kosher Dunkin' Donuts. And when they would come in, he would begin to challenge them in the Gemara. And they saw before them a man who didn't look and wasn't wearing the clothing that Orthodox Jews wear. And they thought he was joking. And then they saw that, of course, he remembered these Gemaras much better than they did, and was able to argue with them and ask them questions, etc., that they were astounded. And he did that because he wanted to, what should we say, he wanted to mislead them theologically. Why is it that two people can go through the same experiences and come out so different? So there's a book by a writer, Peter Gay is his name. I don't know why he chose that name. I don't think he chose it, but that's his given name, Peter Gay. The book is called The Jews of Germany, a Historical Portrait. He is fascinated with a topic related to what I'm fascinated with, but a little bit different. There are German Jews, and I know many of them, who would not go back to Germany now even to visit. Who, if the airplane on the way to Israel is stopping in Frankfurt, they take a different plane. Who wouldn't buy a German product no matter what, because of all that they saw. They grew up in Germany, and they saw all that there was before the terrible Holocaust, and Kristallnacht, and then the Holocaust itself, and they don't want to have anything to do, and they disown in many ways their German culture. On the other hand, there are many Jews who, post-Holocaust, went back to Germany, Bedavka, and they felt that, look, the Nazis were an aberration, the German culture is so wonderful, that's what they grew up with, etc., etc. So Peter Gay looks at the Jews of Germany and tries to understand why some went this way, some went that way. And he has the following sentence. When refugees meet and exchange stories about their escape from Hitler and their lives abroad, and in his case abroad means either England or the United States, each has a unique story to tell. You know, if there are however many million survivors, I don't think there are millions, thousands, tens of thousands, each one has a different story. If you know 2 survivors, you heard 2 different stories. You know 10 survivors, 10 different stories. There's no question. Each has a unique story to tell. Yet each story is like all the others. 2 respects, all the stories are alike. A life bravely made over, but also a dream lost forever. These are 2 components of the stories that all the stories have these 2. Tzad hashava shebahen. They have these 2 things in common. A life bravely made over, because when he interviewed these people, it was already the 1990s, so they had already survived for 40, 50 years, and they had families, and children, and communities, all sorts of accomplishments to their name. A life bravely made over, but also a dream lost forever. And when I came across that phrase, a dream lost forever, I began to understand the connection between the word dream and the word trauma. A trauma is an event that occurs to you which is a dream lost forever. Person is married, he's in love with his wife, she's in love with her husband, they're looking forward to a life together, newlyweds, whatever. They have a dream, children, family, grandchildren, prosperity, health, fun, and then one or the other is tragically killed, died, disease, whatever it is. That's trauma. Why? Because it's a dream lost forever. And one can never, never get over a dream lost forever. You can get over the ravens lost, you can get over the flu. That's not trauma. Trauma is an event that destroys your dream. That is why Holocaust or lesser catastrophes are a dream lost forever. The loss of a child, a young child, is a dream lost forever. The boy was 6, 8, 10, 12, 16, 18. You had a dream. You're going to walk with the child to the chuppah. You're going to be privileged to have grandchildren through the child. That's traumatic. The loss of an aged mother. My mother was almost 90 when she passed away. It was sad, very sad. I feel the loss. I still feel the loss. But it's not trauma. It's not a dream lost forever. I wasn't dreaming that she was going to live forever. at some point we realize that none of us is going to live forever. But when you have a connection to a person, or a connection to a narrative, or to a community, which is a dream, and that dream is destroyed because of some event, that event is a trauma. That's how I would like to suggest is the connection between the English word dream and the German word trauma. Trauma means a lost dream, an important lost dream. That's, an ordinary dream that we all have, but a dream that's really a script that we've written in our fantasy for what life is going to be like. And then something happens, and life is not like that at all. I think the Holocaust survivor that I was personally close to is my father-in-law, may rest in peace, who grew up in Poland in a Hasidic home, the son of a Hasidic Rebbe, and his dream, of course, was that that would be his life. He would be involved with the Hasidim and with his father, and Hasidic Torah, and Hasidic Nigunim, and that particular community, etc., etc. And of course, that was almost totally destroyed. And even that which remained is nowhere near what it was then. So, ad yom moto, until the day he died, he was disturbed by the fact that his dream from the time he was 18, 19 years old, until the time that he died in his late 80s, was lost forever. That's a trauma. What does this have to do with teshuvah? And here is the thesis of my talk for tonight. A teshuvah is also the loss of a dream. It's a response to the loss of a dream. The dream could be, I dream that I'm a tzaddik, I dream that I'm a good Jew, I dream that I could never possibly guilty of whatever I'm guilty of. The dream is based on a self-concept of who I am. And we all have such a self-concept of who we are. That self-concept is sometimes seen in our traditional terms as our Yetzer Tov. Yetzer Tov is not, the good guy inside of us is telling us, don't eat that tray of chocolate or whatever. Yetzer Tov is a psychological force that's inside of us that defines ourselves as being good. Which one of us doesn't really think, I'm basically a good guy? Yeah, every once in a while I do this or I do that, but basically I'm a good person. That's a self-image, and that's looking at the concept Yetzer Tov in a self-image way. However, very few of us, maybe none of us, live up totally to that self-definition because we slip up. We get lazy and we don't wake up to go to davening. We're tempted in various ways and we eat what we shouldn't, or we speak words that we shouldn't speak. We're involved in various interpersonal relationships in our family or in our shul, in our work setting, and we insult a person or put him down or call him a name or whatever. At this time of year, when the concept of teshuvah comes up, what we're really struggling with is the inconsistency, the poor fit between who I really think I am, but then there's this guy who did all these other things. How does that fit with my self-concept? That's why teshuvah is called teshuvah. Teshuvah is usually referred to as repentance. A few people here who've heard me speak before know that I have this hang-up about many, many Hebrew words that we commonly translate into English in a certain way, but that's not what they mean. Kedusha does not mean holiness. Baracha does not mean blessing. These are two common words that everyone mistranslates. Kedusha means distinctiveness, separateness. Baracha means bounty, plentifulness. Teshuvah does not mean repentance. Teshuvah means return. That's what the word teshuvah means. It's not the same thing as repentance. Even the word atonement doesn't fit very well for the words that we use. Kapara, slicha, mechila. Forgiveness is better. But tshuva certainly does not mean repentance as many of us think of repentance. Repentance might be one component of tshuva. When we say, Oshamnu Bogadnu, or Al Chet Shechatonu, that's repentance, but that's only one piece of tshuva. That's a vidui, a confessional repentance. Tshuva means return. So what are we returning to? So the psukim say, we're starting to read these psukim over and over again, we're returning to the Ribbono Shel Olam, returning to God. In psychological terms, and Sforim, Hasidic Sforim especially emphasize the aspect of tshuva, which is we are returning to ourselves. We are returning to who we really, really are. In the sense that I'm using it tonight, we're returning to the self-image we have of ourselves, to our Yetzer Tov, which is, I am this basically good guy who messed up, made a mistake, got tempted, whatever words we use to minimize the discrepancy between who we really are or think we really are and the various activities that we did. The struggle of tshuva is the struggle with the inconsistency. It's the struggle to recover the lost dream of who I really am. By the way, these concepts that I'm introducing or sharing with you tonight are especially true not only in the process of tshuva, which is essentially an introspective process. Tshuva, you look into yourself. Very few examples that I know of a group tshuva, a group therapy type of tshuva, although it's an interesting idea. But usually tshuva is cheshbon hanefesh that we each make with ourselves. But the concepts that I'm sharing with you tonight are especially relevant not only to tshuva as introspection, because you're introspecting to recover the dream of who you really are, who you know you are and could be, but it's also an essential component of parenting and of education, of parenting and of chinuch. The realization that this kid that you're dealing with, who now is acting spoiled and acting like a real brat and giving you a hard time, or acting in a chinuch setting off the derech or off the wall or whatever expressions you use, really there's a part of him or her that's very, very different from the way he's acting. And that's the part that this person, this child, is, wants to be, and could be. And if you treat a person not as they are in their outside behavior, but as they really are, as whom they really want to be and whom they could be, then the person gradually becomes who he or she could be. But we're talking tonight not of dealing with other people, but of dealing with yourself, getting back to the person that you inside yourself know you could be. There's a passage in the writings of Rav Tzadok HaKohen, whose writings are so very, very insightful, and who says things that sometimes are shocking when you realize it's coming from a Hasidic Rebbe in Poland who died, I think, in 1900 or soon after. And one of the things he writes is, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's close to these words. Just like it's important to believe in the Ribbono Shel Olam, it's important to believe in yourself. When someone showed me that, I first saw that, I didn't think I was reading correctly. But that's exactly what he says. It's important to believe in yourself. And then he goes on, in his words, in a terminology that's Hasidic, but not the terminology that I'm using. He says, because if you believe in yourself, you get in touch with the self, the real self that's inside of you, what I'm calling the Yetzer Tov, the self-concept, the dream that we have of who we really are, that we're trying to retrieve during this time of the year. We're trying to tell ourselves and prove to ourselves and prove to Ribbono Shel Olam that the various misdeeds that we did during the year, we all did misdeeds, that these were aberrations. This wasn't the real me. This was me in an angry moment. This was me in a selfish moment. This was me in a drunken moment. This was me in a lazy moment, etc. But the real me is different, and I want to get in touch with him, and that's the process of tshuva. It's interesting. I asked a colleague here who's a psychologist how you say trauma in Ivrit. So of course he answered trauma, But I wondered in classical Ivrit, in Tanakh, what word can we use that comes close to trauma? And the word for me is charada. Even though the word is sometimes now the full meaning of chared, charada, vayecharad, is obscured by the fact that it's become a sociological term for a group of people, charedim. But the term biblically is a very, very powerful word. And it's so powerful that it really is the ultimate reason behind the mitzvah which we're about to fulfill less than a week now, well, a little more than a week from this time of day, the mitzvah of Tkiyat shofar. The shofar is the ultimate tool of establishing, of shaking a person up so that she can end the trivialities, the superficialities, the aberrations, and get back to the dream. Imitaka shofar ba'ir, va'am lo yecharadu. Navi Amos asked the question, can you sound the shofar in a town and won't the people have charada? Won't the people tremble? Won't the people be traumatized? That's the point of the shofar. The point of the shofar is to traumatize you, to put you in touch with, hey, things are not the way you think. You have a dream, the dream is an illusion. You have to get back to reality. That's what shofar does. In ancient times, the shofar was a sound that the enemy is coming. That's why yimitaka shofar be'ir va'am lo yecharadu. You think you're sitting safely? I want to tell you something. There's a guy digging a tunnel right under your house. You don't even know it. But there are many, many other places in Tanakh and many stories, some familiar to everyone, some not so familiar, where you have the same charada, which is being shaken from a reality that you thought was a reality, and then you find out, no, that's not the reality. You were absolutely certain that this was the reality. And then you find out someone's bursting through a tunnel in your living room. The most familiar story probably is with Yitzchak Avinu, right? Yitzchak Avinu was absolutely certain that he knew who his kids were, like all parents are. I know my kids, right? This Esav guy, he's terrific. He asks me all these great questions. He's a real frummy, and he's my boy. And Yaakov, he's a lazy schlepper. That Yitzchak was as certain of that as any of us are certain of anything. And then one fine day he finds out that it's not quite true, that Yaakov is not whom he thinks he is, and Esav is not whom he thinks he was. So what's Yitzchak's response? The pasuk says, "Vayecherad Yitzchak charada gedola ad ma'od." The same word, charada. Vayecherad, but the Tanakh, the Chumash makes it even more explicit. Not only vayecherad, vayecherad charada, and not only charada, but charada gedola. All of a sudden, his eyes were open. Not his physical eyes; he remained blind, but it's symbolic. His eyes were open to a new reality. And that new reality required him to, in a sense, to do tshuva, to rethink everything that got him to that position. We don't know too much from the Chumash about how Yitzchak rethought, but obviously he did. He gave Yaakov a bracha even after that point. So obviously, Yitzchak rethought what he was going to do. It's interesting. Was a Hasidic dynasty. It may still be some remnants of it, but in Poland, it was the second largest Hasidut after the Gera Hasidim number. And they were the Hasidim of Alexander. Word Alexander was the name of Alexandro was the name of a small town in Poland, and that's where this Hasidic dynasty was. And one of the Rebbes in the pre-World War II years was known for the name of his sefer. His sefer is called the Yismach Yisrael. So it's a Hasidic sefer up there with the top Hasidic form of the 20th century. By the way, when it comes to insights into all kinds of processes that have to do with emotions, like tshuva, the early 20th century literature of Hasidus is unparalleled. I mean, if you think about it, not from a Jewish point of view, religious point of view, but from a secular point of view, the existence of men like the Ishbitzer, Reb Tzadok, the Sfas Emetz, the Yismach Yisrael, on, the Rebbes of the early 20th century, it's amazing of the depth of their ideas just from the point of view of psychology. So one of the favorite texts of the Yismach Yisrael, the Sefer Yismach Yisrael, is, of all things, on the pasuk by Hagar. All right, the pasuk says by Hagar, "Vayifkach Elokim es eineha vatere be'er mayim." Ribbon Shalom opened her eyes. She was stuck in the desert. Her son Nebuch was dying. Her son Yishmael. So we wish things would have turned out differently, perhaps. But her eyes, God opened her eyes. Amar Rabbi Binyamin, the Medrash says on this famous pasuk, Amar Rabbi Binyamin, Hakol b'cheskas sumin. Everyone is blind. We are all blind. Ad she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu me'ir es eineihem. Until God opens our eyes. This is the period of time we're entering into right now, the period of time of the year. To have the realization that in a certain sense we are all blind. We don't see. And we need something to shake us up. Better if it's just the sound of a shofar, but it's a opening of the eyes that's required. That's another one of the connections of tshuva to trauma. In the psychological study of the subject of trauma, like in many fields, there's one book that's known in the field as the Bible of the psychology of trauma. Like Lahavdil, our Bible is our foundational text. So too in every area, there's a book, several books that are considered the basic text. So the basic text in the psychology of trauma, and if you're interested in this kind of subject, I recommend it to you because it's an easy read, very interesting. The book is written by a woman called Judith Lewis Herman, Herman, and it's called simply Trauma and Recovery. She was one of the first people to really scientifically study many, many types of trauma, many different kinds of populations. Her specialty was abused women, but other types of trauma and recovery from trauma, how you come back from trauma. So there are a few things that she writes, which are so close to the process of tshuva, trauma and the recovery from trauma, spiritual trauma and tshuva, so closely related that it's mind-boggling. Here's one of the things she writes. This is in her introduction. I think it's the very first words of her introduction. The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. All right. Once we realize we have what the great Rishonim called hakoras hachet, we recognize that we sin. All right, Ribbon Shalom, here it is, this week to Rosh Hashanah. Last Pesach, I ate something I shouldn't have eaten. I couldn't help it. I just was so hungry, and here was this, it wasn't even chametz gamur, it was whatever, and I ate it. Or I just couldn't stand it anymore. I lost my temper, and I made I just reduced that person to rubble. I just criticized that. And now I feel terribly guilty about it. So one natural response, I'm just translating from her kind of trauma to Averos, the sins. The same mechanism. But then the ordinary response is to banish them from consciousness, right? What we'd like to do is, forget about it. I was angry that day, I wasn't thinking straight, I was too hungry. It's not part of me, it's not the real me, forget about it. However, she continues, atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. The person suffered real trauma, but I'd love to forget about it. It doesn't go away. If it's a real trauma, it's not going to go away. If it's a real sin, it's not going to go away. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. The central dialectic of psychological trauma is I want to forget about it. Just forget about it. Go on. Get on with it. Get a life. Forget about it. That's one end of it. The other end is no, I want to dwell on it. I want to tell about it. I want to tell the story. I want to get it out of my system, but by talking about it, by sharing it, by analyzing it, etc., etc. That's a central dialectic. And interestingly, that's the central dialectic in Tehillim. You go through Tehillim where David HaMelech, by the way, who is the paragon of tshuva in our tradition? All right, David HaMelech. The Gemara says, David HaMelech hu hagever hukam ol shehekim ulo shel tshuva. That David HaMelech is the model of a Baal tshuva. David HaMelech, we're not supposed to say this. The Gemara says, Kol omer David choto, you're not supposed to say he sinned. But David HaMelech himself said he sinned. He said, Chotasi, v'hara be'einecho asisi. This was David's statement, Tehillim, Kapitel Nun Aleph. So David sinned, and he knew he sinned, and he was sorry that he sinned, and he was afraid that his sins would do him in, and he'd be punished for them, etc., etc., etc. And his enemies made fun of him because of his sins, and he wanted to get past that, etc., etc. If you read Tehillim, that's one of the major themes of Tehillim in terms of the narratives of Tehillim. But David HaMelech, if you go through to his relationship with his sin, he is struggling with two different tendencies. On the one hand, he says, Ashrei Nusui Pesha Chasu Chato'o. That fortunate is the person who hides his sins, Kisui Chato'o, who covers over his sins, who keeps them secret, keeps them private. We're not supposed to say vidui normally out loud, because vidui is supposed to be between you and Ribbon Shalom. There's another religion that has a public confessional, or you confess to another human being. We confess to Ribbon Shalom. And that's Ashrei Nesui Pesha Kesui Chato. Cover it over. That's one tendency. On the other hand, David HaMelech says that no, I want to tell it to Kahol Rav. I want to tell people that I sinned. I want them to know that I sinned. I want them to know that I'm looking for forgiveness. So David HaMelech experiences what she calls the central dialectic. And this is something that we all bear within us. Do we want to just suppress it and forget about it and go further? Or do we want to examine it, really have true remorse, true charota, etc., and bring it out? And obviously there's no right or wrong answer. It depends on the sin. Rabbi Yonah in his Sefer Shari Tshuva discusses different types of averos, different types of tshuva. But that's another connection. But then she goes on to say, the main contribution of her book, which is why I recommend it to those of you who are interested in this topic, is the steps to recovering from trauma. And here, these are so parallel to steps to recovering from sin, recovering from spiritual trauma, tshuva. First of all, she writes that the most important thing for a person to recover, truly recover from trauma, is what she calls reconnection. Connecting again. Connecting to what, to whom? First of all, quote, this simple statement, I know I have myself. Victims of trauma at some point realize they can't trust this one anymore, they can't trust that one, but they know they have themselves. They have themselves. The realization that I have the strength to do it. This, she says, could stand as the emblem of recovery. Her task now, the victim's task, is to become the person she wants to be. Get back to that Yetzer Tov, that good person inside. The recreation of an ideal self involves the active exercise of imagination and fantasy. We want to recreate an ideal self. The ideal self, in our terms tonight, the self you could be, you want to be, you think you really are, but you didn't, you messed up. So to get back to that, you have to recreate the ideal self, and that takes imagination. It's interesting to refer again to one of the great Hasidic Rebbes of the earlier 20th century who was killed in the Holocaust, the famous Piatzezner Rebbe, Eish Kodesh. So he had an exercise, he wrote a sefer called Chovas HaTalmidim. His Hasidim were 15-year-olds, 14-year-old boys. He had like what we call today a high school. And he used to tell them every year, he took in a new group of boys, he would sit with them. He had a boy named Ruvain. He would say, Ruvain, who are you today? Tell me who you are. He would say, I come from such and such a shtetl, and this is my family, and I came to your yeshiva, I want to learn Bava Metzia, whatever. Okay, Reuven, who are you? Tell me about Reuven a year from now. What that Reuven is going to look like. A fascinating technique. Of course, the kid looks at him like, kids don't think that way. But he guided them in thinking that way. Imagine whom you could be, who you would like to be, how you would like to change in the next year. You're going to be a year in a yeshiva, in the Hasidic yeshiva. Imagine, use your imagination, and use the Yiddish word, whatever it is, for imagination and fantasy. Imagine. You're going to be a little taller, a little heavier. Physically, how you're going to be different. Emotionally, how you're going to be different. How your relationship with your friends is going to be different. How your relationship with your parents is going to be different. To get back to that ideal self, one has to use imagination. And that's like an ingredient in tshuva too. Tshuva doesn't only mean, I'm sorry I sinned. It means having a concept of future, of who am I going to be? What am I going to be like? Not tomorrow. Tomorrow I know. Hersh made tshuva, we're all careful. Who am I going to be Purim time? Who am I going to be next Pesach? Who am I going to be next summer? What am I going to be like? How am I going to be different? And to think about that. It's not something we often do, but it's, according to Dr. Herman, it's a step on the way to recovering from trauma. And according to my understanding of tshuva, it's a way of making tshuva permanent. How do we all know this. By ne'ilah, there's not a person in this room who's not going to really feel full of tshuva. Ne'ilah, I'm going to say the slichas, we cry out, Hashem hu Elokim 3 times or 7 times, they're really going to mean it. And then by Weinreb, it's already a different person. By the next day, by Cholamite Sukkos, we're back to the same old self. But if you have this kind of an ego image of what you could be, what you want to be, and flesh it out in some details, it helps a great deal. She has a lot more to say about tshuva, about trauma, which connects to tshuva, but there's one thing she says which is interesting. She says, all this is good news. There are many, many tips she has, techniques, how to recover from trauma. And there are many, many things to say about how to do tshuva. But she ends the book with saying, but I have to tell you one thing, it's not going to make you feel so good. The resolution of the trauma is never final. Recovery is never complete. Never complete. By the way, the secret of the success of the most successful psychological program to cure an illness that exists in the whole history of psychology is the 12 steps, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the recovery from alcoholism. It's the most successful if one follows it. What's the secret of the success? The secret of the success of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is you're never cured. You're always an alcoholic. You always have to be careful. You can never, ever drink again. There can't be an excuse. If you do, you're regressing all the way back to step 0. It sounds rather harsh, but what she's saying too, Dr. Herman, when it comes to trauma, you always have to be vigilant, can always come back, you always have to be on top of it. And the same thing is true of tshuva. And this is what David HaMelech says again in Tehillim. V'chatosi lenegdi tomit. David HaMelech says, my sin is in front of my eyes forever. David HaMelech had a promise from the Navi. The Navi told him that Ribbono Shel Olam forgave him. Ribbono Shel Olam himself came to David and said, I forgive you. You're forgiven, you're forgiven. By the way, he was forgiven for some of his sins. What he was not forgiven for, and that's why he couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash, was because he shed blood, even in warfare. It's an interesting side note. But for the big sin that he did with Bathsheba, he was forgiven. But nevertheless, for David himself, v'chatosi lenegdi tomid. I'm always concerned. Always has to be vigilant. This is the quote bad news. It's not over by ne'ilah. Tshuva is something that one has to perpetuate for the rest of one's life. In fact, when they talk about great tzaddikim, I just came across of a fascinating sefer. Machon Yerushalayim just published an autobiography of Rab Chaim Palaji. Rab Chaim Palaji was one of the great Sephardi Gedolim of the late 19th, early 20th century. A tzaddik and a Talmud Chacham, an unbelievable person. and they published a book called his biography. I couldn't believe it. Which Gadol B'Yisrael wrote a biography? It's almost gaiva to write a biography. I know a fellow who wrote a book about Moshe Rabbeinu, a fictional book, and he wanted to call it the autobiography of Moses. So he went to the publisher. The publisher was Paulus Press, so the head of Paulus Press was a Jesuit priest. Jesuit priest says to him, "You can't call a book the autobiography of Moses. Moses was the humblest of men. Humble men don't write autobiographies." You know? So that was my reaction when I saw this sefer. Then I opened it up. What the editor did is he went through all of Reb Chaim Valaji's Sfarim. He wrote many, many Sfarim. A lot of Sephardi Gedolim wrote, like Avad Yosef, Zechar Levrocha. I don't know how many Sfarim he wrote, 100, 200, 300, many, many Sfarim. In other circles, you know, Chaim Brisker wrote one little sefer. But the Sfardim write many, many Sfarim, and Chaim Valaji is like that. So what this editor did is he went through all these various Sfarim, and wherever in the middle of the Sefer he caught a word where he refers to himself. So some person's writing a Sefer, a great Rav says, I believe that you don't have to do such and such and such, but me, myself, I conduct myself this way. So he took all these phrases, I myself, I do things this way, and he put it together, and when he does all that for hundreds of Sfarim, dozens of Sfarim, it becomes an autobiography. You learn much about him. So one of the things he writes about himself in one of these statements is, for me, every month is Elul. And so he writes, Li Elul, Kol Hashana is Elul. All year long is Elul. And you find that such phrases, many, many Gedolei Yisrael. Every month is Elul. What we tend to do, like in America, you know, you honor your mother on Mother's Day and your father on Father's Day. What about the rest of the year? So we have the same type of attitude about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day for tshuva. Or Seres Yemei Tshuva is a day for tshuva. Elul is a day for tshuva. I mean, there's no avera to do tshuva on Chanukah or Asar B'Teves or Tanis Esther, whatever. Tshuva is a constant part of a person's life. So these are some reflections that I have on the connections between the concept of trauma and the concept of tshuva. I want to thank you very much for inviting me, to give me an opportunity to share some of these ideas. And I want to wish you all a kasiva v'chasima tova, shana of bracha and shalom, hatzlacha, parnasa, nachas, simcha v'chol tov.